So you became a faculty member at Harvard, where you were a faculty member for 30 years. Now we're going to go into some of your primary areas of research interest while a faculty member at Harvard, and of course thereafter. You've got a recent book published just this year, 2018. So your research and scholarship has had a very significant national and international impact. Tell us first about what you believe was your most influential or high impact research.
Well, I can't, I don't really know which was, I started out, let me explain it this way. I started out looking at, because I had done, let's see, I don't know how to tell the story, so you'll have to do some editing here.
Okay.
My doctoral thesis was an intervention into the language development of children in the Boston African American community. An intervention that I felt perfectly justified in intervening, because these children were in a lousy daycare center, a private daycare center. And the children were basically told to sit around the wall and be good. Toys were up on a high shelf where the kids never could get them. It was a place designed to repress language development, if that were possible. Luckily, you can't repress it. You can keep it from flowering, but you can't repress language development. It's going to develop. But so this intervention was taking the children one at a time into a little tiny room and reading to them and talking with them and so on. And I continued to do similar work on the development of language in educational settings once I became a faculty member at Harvard. And that was also really part of the war on poverty, or made possible by the war on poverty, because one of the federal government projects was the creation of regional research centers. And Harvard had one for only a few years, and it was a center for the study of educational diversity. Diversity was in the title. I may not have it exactly right. And so when I got my degree, I first started working as a research associate as part of that center's project. And then started giving courses, and I gave a course for a number of years on child language. And people used to tease me. They'd say, you know, it sounds like with animal language or child language. Why not children's language? Or no, child language. So I gave a course on child language for a number of years. And my first book, long out of print, was called, I think, Child Language and Education.
1972.
1972.
Yes.
Yeah. And that was the book. To get tenure at Harvard, you really have to have a book. And never mind just articles. And I had that book in galley form.
Okay.
It hadn't been published.
Mm-hmm.
Or I think I had, actually it may have been just a draft, but it was enough. And I guess I had a publication contract, because it wasn't published till 72, and this would have been 65. Anyway, that was what I taught for quite a few years. And then, a few years later, I decided that I really should try to see if knowing what I then knew about child language and language development would make a difference if I tried to be a teacher again. So I took a leave in 1974-75 when I had been at Harvard, counting graduate school and then this combination of research and teaching and then full-time teaching and getting tenure. For 13 years. I took a leave and went across the country to San Diego and taught for a year in San Diego. And in this book that you mentioned, that has just been published, Communicative Competence, Classroom Interaction, and Educational Equity, and it's a selection of things that I've written and published over the years. And the second or third chapter second chapter is called How Knowledge About Language Helps the Classroom Teacher, comma, or does it, question mark, a personal account. This was written after I got back, right after I got back from that year's teaching. And it's become a favorite article. It's very accessible. It was first published in a journal for teachers. And when I started putting this book together, several people wrote me and said, you've got to include that article. So here it is. And I've found it a very hard job, going back to teaching again. And I tried to spell out some of the ways in which I thought the language knowledge in my head helped, but many ways in which it was much more difficult for me than it had been before. Partly because I had too many ideas about what the education should be, and it was hard for me to settle on one and do something consistently, which you have to do as a teacher.
Sure. What a fabulous experience, though, to actually go back and apply what you had and give it a try and practice.
It got a lot of kudos at the time that I had done that. So it was, well, I'm delighted that now, in retrospect, that I did it and that I wrote about it, etc.
Fabulous. You have another book that has had quite an impact, and it's called Classroom Discourse, The Language of Teaching and Learning. I think the most recent reprint of that was in 2001. Can you tell us a little bit about that book?
The most recent edition was in 2001.
Okay.
The most recent printing was this year.
Oh, good. Okay, so that's
it's still being used, but now this is detail on the publication world. Now the royalties I get are less from people buying the book and more from people buying rights to reprint parts of the book.
Oh, interesting.
And I suspect that's not unique to that book at all. You know, I mean, you probably, I don't know the pattern at ASU, but many people, instead of assigning books, they put together their own textbooks of
Using articles.
Using articles.
Yes.
And you have to get permission now. There's much more control over getting permission and paying for permission
Yes.
to use those articles in what is really a self-published textbook, just tailor-made for your course.
Yes.
But that's the two are related because while I was teaching that 1 year out in San Diego, I had made arrangements with a professor of sociology at the University of California, San Diego, UCSD. And he and a couple of his graduate students videotaped my classrooms. His name was Hugh Meehan. He was the director of a small, excellent teacher training program. And at UCSD. And he wrote a book called Learning Lessons, in which he analyzed the interaction between me as a classroom teacher and the children in the classroom, 25 children in the classroom, who were, as I remember it, not a white child in the classroom. They were about half African American and half Mexican American.
Mm-hmm.
I played no part in that book or in his research, except that I was the classroom teacher and I wrote a little 2-page forward to the book saying, I'm the teacher who taught these lessons.
Okay.
But I got interested in the patterns of interaction that he uncovered and that we talked about together while he was doing the research and I was doing the teaching. So when I went back to Harvard after that experience, instead of teaching a course in child language, I gave a course in classroom discourse, and taught that for many years. And that became the basis for the discourse book.
For your discourse book, yes. Classroom discourse.
Which is now, it's called Classroom Discourse.
Right.
Which is now the one that is still being reprinted from the 2001 second edition.
So that was a turning point in your research career.
That was a turning point in my research career, from looking at individual child language development to look at the teacher-children interaction and the ways in which it affects both what is taught and the development of the language in which it's talked about.
Sure. So some of the viewers of this show are practitioners or teachers. And so based on your research in this area, in terms of classroom interaction and discourse, what would you recommend to teachers and even beginning teachers possibly in terms of this area?
I really don't want to make that, I mean, ideally, see, there's an ideal world and there's a real world. Ideally, there would be much more open-ended discussion. And all the people who are teaching know that that would be the ideal. But, and it's a huge but, teachers today have to prepare their kids for all the tests they have to take. And those are high-stake tests. High stakes for the kids and high stakes for the teachers. So they know it's not an ideal world, that they can't teach the way they would like to teach if they're going to face the reality, the real world. So I'm glad I hate to say this, but I'm glad I'm not trying to train teachers
Nowadays,
now.
given the policy and
Given
political
the
conflicts.
policies, because we can't do it right.
Yeah, it's trumping their liberties to have open discourse and interaction. Agreed. You also turned your work to educational equity as one of your other.
Well, it wasn't turning,
Okay.
because remember that first question that I went back to Harvard with was about educational equity, because it was about why do kids who are kids of color or kids of poverty have a harder time getting the grades and going on to college. That's basically a question of equity. So it's not turning.
Yeah.
It's continuing.
A theme that's run through your research your entire career.
Yeah.